Okay, so we'll start by looking at some life course theories. Now, essentially what we're doing when we're looking at life course theories is looking at this age crime curve and looking at what happens throughout the life course. So, for example, what is it about some people in their kind of early teens that might set them on this trajectory up to delinquency? Similarly, what is it that happens at this kind of age that helps people tail off and move away from crime? Life course theories look at the life course as a whole, looking at different turning points, different characteristics, different peer groups and things like that, to see what are the certain things, what are the characteristics of someone's life that might either encourage or discourage them from engaging in criminal behaviour. Now, there's a couple of people who have been really influential in this area. David Farrington is probably the most well-known person doing work in this area. He was responsible for the Cambridge study, which is what this first video will look at. You've also got Terry Moffat, who's responsible for a typology that looks at life course persistent offending and adolescence limited offending. So we'll look at that distinction in the next video as well. But essentially what the life course theories are trying to answer is this question here. Why is it that some people persist in committing crime? So why do they carry on doing it throughout the life course? And why do some people desist? So desistance is the process of stopping doing something. So that distinction between persistence and desistance is an important distinction to make, and that's the question that we're going to be trying to answer over the next 2 or 3 videos. So we're going to look first off at the Cambridge study. The Cambridge study was a prospective study of delinquent behaviour that started in the early 1960s. So it's prospective because what it did is it started looking at children when they were young and following them up throughout their lives. So if we were looking back at what behaviour was like, that would be a retrospective study. If we're thinking about what we're doing from this point onwards, that's a prospective study. The sample of the Cambridge study was 411 boys from South London, so typically around the kind of Brixton area, typically white, typically working class, all around the age of 8 to 9 years old when the study started. And the whole idea behind this study was to collect this rich data set of comprehensive life histories of each of these boys so that the researchers could identify different points within their lives, different personality traits, different events that happen that might trigger a kind of criminal trajectory. So when we're talking about kind of rich life histories and comprehensive life histories, we're looking at a range of different data that's being collected. So information about peer relationships in childhood, family size, parental behaviour, parental skill, how they did at school, when they kind of grew up, did they have relationships, did they have jobs, did they have adequate housing, what was their sexual history like, were they promiscuous, were they faithful, because obviously these things can indicate impulsivity potentially. And then they also obviously looked at criminal history, both self-reported and looking at official records. So they weren't just relying on the guys themselves telling them if they had engaged in criminal behaviour, but they were also looking at official crime records. This data set is really rich, it's really kind of comprehensive. It contains qualitative and quantitative data, so they'll have interview data from the participants themselves, their families, their partners, their teachers, their peers, but also quantitative data looking at kind of indices of impulsivity, of personality, of self-reported behaviour and things like that. And like I've already said, the range of sources, the participants themselves, parents, teachers, peers, partners, employers, a range of different techniques to try and kind of triangulate and bring all of this data together to have a really rich indication of who these people are and what might have triggered their potential criminal behaviour. At the time of recording this, there's been so many papers published from the Cambridge study, it would be impossible for me to cover all of them, not necessarily in a single video, but in a series of videos, I think. So there's been well over 200 papers that have been published from this study, from this data set, and you can find some of those on the website of David Farrington, which is linked at the beginning of the video. In terms of some kind of highlights of the Cambridge study, 41% of the sample were convicted of a criminal offence at some point. So 41% of around 450-ish. So you're looking at around maybe 370, something like that, people convicted of a criminal offence. That said, 7% of the sample were responsible for more than 50% of all of the offences that were committed. So this goes back to that kind of age crime curve, which is essentially saying that a very small number of people are responsible for a large proportion of the offending behaviour that's taking place. This is kind of consistent with the idea that some people are persisting throughout the course of their life, whereas a much bigger number of people are engaging in kind of short bursts of offending behaviour, maybe in adolescence and early adulthood. So yeah, less than 7% of the sample were responsible for more than 50% of all total offences. But importantly, what the researchers have identified is that if people were desisting before the age of 21, so they were stopping committing offences before the age of 21, then they were just as likely to have successful lives as those who were never convicted of any offence in the first place. So when we're talking about a successful life, we're thinking about effective relationships, we're talking about having adequate accommodation, having families, being employed, these kind of generally accepted indices of a successful life. And obviously persistent offenders were the least successful people in their life, so they were less likely to be employed, they were less likely to have stable relationships and adequate housing and things like that. So this really highlights the importance of being able to intervene early and to identify different things that you might be able to put in place to stop people, even if they have started committing offences early in life, to try and stop them from committing offences by the age of 18, 19, 20, but definitely no later than 21. Now, the key contribution of the Cambridge study to the area of forensic psychology and criminology is to identify risk factors, promotive factors, and protective factors for criminal behaviour and delinquency. Just to kind of quickly define what these mean, a risk factor is a variable that directly increases your likelihood of committing an offence. A promotive factor is something that directly reduces the chance of committing an offence, and a protective factor is something that negates the effect of a risk factor. So we're thinking about risk being risk of offending, promotive being promoting of good behaviour, and protective of protecting against a risk factor. This is the key contribution of the Cambridge study, and it's been able to identify a whole range of different risk, protective and promotive factors for particularly for juvenile delinquency. Just to kind of highlight some of those, so risk factors for delinquency include low levels of intelligence, high levels of impulsivity, people coming from low income or low socioeconomic backgrounds, and people having a poor parenting style. So for example, if you have low levels of parental supervision, you're not achieving well in school, and you come from a deprived background, you're much more likely to be engaging in criminal behaviour than those who don't have those risk factors. Promotive factors for non-delinquency include low levels of nervousness, so maybe being able to stand up for yourself, not necessarily being subject to peer pressure. So if you're not nervous, you're more likely to be able to say no to peers when they're trying to kind of coerce you into engaging in criminal behaviour. Having a low number of friends, so again kind of not being able to be coaxed into those kind of peer pressure situations, and having a mother in employment. Now this might be a statistical artifact of when the study was conducted, and it might be confounded a little bit with this low family income risk factor. So if we think about when the study was run, or when it was first launched, in the 60s it wasn't necessarily the norm for women and mothers to be in employment. So what this mother in employment factor might be is less related to the mother being in employment, but just the household having a greater level of financial income. Protective factors against non-delinquency include having high levels of intelligence, so that is protective against a poor parenting style. So for example, if you're a child who doesn't have parental supervision, for example, it might be that if you're invested in your studies, you're less likely to be out on the streets getting yourself into trouble. If a child is naturally disruptive, they have high levels of impulsivity, they have low inhibitions, having a parent that's got good supervision skills and good parenting skills is protective against that for obvious reasons, in that if you've got a child who's naturally trying to get themselves into trouble or has a natural propensity to engage in impulsive acts and kind of really impulsive behaviours, then having that tight supervision around them is obviously going to be protective against them getting in trouble and acting in a delinquent way. And having a high family income is protective against having a parent who's been convicted. So we know that people who come from families who have a conviction in the family, they're more likely themselves to become engaged with the criminal justice system, whether that's that the police and the kind of justice system is looking more closely at that family, or if there actually is a maybe genetic or a learnt link to criminal behaviour. Having a high family income protects against that. So again, it might be that having that high family income, it allows you to engage in extracurricular activities and keeps you off the streets and stops you from becoming involved in delinquent behaviour with maybe aberrant peer groups. Another contribution is that the earlier the age of onset for criminal behaviour, the more entrenched that behaviour becomes. So this kind of stands to reason in that the earlier someone starts committing offences, obviously the more time they have to commit offences. So for example, if I had started committing offences at the age of 10, naturally I would have 4 extra years of delinquency than someone who started committing offences at the age of 14. So it stands to reason that just by the passage of time, I'm more likely to have engaged in more criminal behaviour. But what the Cambridge study has been able to do is to average out the number of convictions that people have based on the age of onset of their delinquency. So for example, people who have an age of onset of delinquency of between 10 and 13 years average 9 convictions over the course of their life. Those who start committing offences between the ages of 14 and 16 have an average of 6 convictions, whereas those who start offending after the age of 16 have an average of 2 convictions. So again, what this is doing is it's highlighting the importance of early intervention. So can we stop people from engaging in criminal behaviour until they're a little bit later, if they are going to engage in that kind of behaviour? And if they do start committing crimes, how do we stop them from doing that definitely before the age of 21, like we've already covered? So again, understanding the importance of factors that might impact on early onset offending is really important, because once we identify those risk factors for early onset offending, we can start to put into place prevention programs that maybe stop people from doing that at such an early age. So that's exactly what Farrington did. He looked at what the factors that were present in those who were starting to be delinquent very early, so before the age of 10. And he identified exactly the same kinds of risk factors that we've already covered. So things like disruptive child behaviour, so people being troublesome or dishonest, was a real big issue in those who were delinquent compared to those who weren't delinquent between the ages of kind of 8 and 10 years. Having criminality in the family, having low intelligence or low school attainment or engagement, also a risk factor. Coming from an environment where there's poor child rearing in terms of a lack of discipline. And obviously some of these will interact with each other. So if you've got someone who is naturally impulsive and there's a lack of discipline in the home, those things are likely to compound each other and lead to even more or an increased risk of early onset delinquency. And again, the one thing that's been really consistent throughout this study is the idea of social isolation being protective against delinquent behaviour. So again, we're looking at children who are potentially getting involved in peer groups that are delinquent. If you have low levels of, if you don't have many friends, or if you have higher levels of social isolation, you just have fewer opportunities to engage in that kind of behaviour. So while it's not necessarily a positive in terms of social development and child's well-being, it does seem to be protective against delinquency for hopefully obvious reasons. Now, these findings have really clear policy implications in terms of developmental prevention. So this is a real key idea that stems from the Farrington studies and the Cambridge study in particular. The idea that we can prevent people from engaging in criminal behaviour from a developmental perspective just by looking at these risk factors and the protective factors that we can identify. So, for example, what this prevention approach is trying to do is essentially build up people's protective factors. It's not necessarily trying to promote non-delinquency. It acknowledges that people do have risk factors, and it's trying to directly have an impact on those, because people who have promotive factors or high levels of promotive factors in the absence of risk factors are probably not going to be delinquent in the first place. But what these programs are targeting are those children with several risk factors and trying to directly negate the implications or the effects of those risk factors. So, for example, having cognitive behavioural training or mindfulness in school settings is trying to address the risk factor of impulsivity. Having parenting training, so Sure Start centres, for example, addresses maybe a lack of skill in terms of discipline or child rearing. Most of us come from schools that have had kind of breakfast clubs or after school clubs, extracurricular activities. What these are doing is they're trying to enrich both the intellectual and the social development of children. So they're trying to negate the effects of low intelligence, or maybe even trying to encourage people to move away from delinquent peer groups and into more pro-social activities. Now, Farrington advocates that this is a primary prevention, and what that means is that it's targeted at the entire population. So what they're not doing is they're not saying this group of children are at risk of becoming delinquent, so therefore we will pour all of our money and all of our attention onto those children. What they're doing is they're rolling out these initiatives across the board to everybody, because even if people don't have risk factors, these kinds of things are likely to improve their lives, improve their prospects further down the line. And what he suggests is that these schemes should be introduced before the age of 10, because we know that those who are impulsive or not achieving in school or have kind of disruptive or chaotic family environments between the ages of 8 and 10 are much more likely to be engaging in criminal behaviour and delinquency as they go into their kind of early teenage years. So yeah, having these before the age of 10 is the kind of gold standard and the ideal for these primary prevention approaches.